Contarte Historias presents Sherlock, Lupin and Me. The Dark Lady by Irene Adler. Illustrations inspired by the work of Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. Chapter 1. 3 Friends. Would you believe that I was the first and only girlfriend of Sherlock Holmes, the famous detective? When we met, though, he wasn't a detective yet. And he wasn't famous. I was 12, and he was only a little older than me. It was summer, the 6th of July, to be exact. And I can still remember perfectly the time I first met him. He was sitting in a corner on top of the city walls, his back up against the creeping ivy. In the sky above him, seagulls circled in slow spirals. There was nothing beyond him but the sea, an endless expanse of dark and sparkling blue. Sherlock had his chin resting on his knees, and he was completely absorbed in reading a book. He was almost scowling at it, as if the world depended on him finishing it. I don't think he would have even noticed me if I hadn't spoken to him. Since I'd just come to St. Malo, I asked him if he lived here. No, he said without even taking his eyes off his book. I live in a house. 49 Rue Saint-Sauveur. What a strange sense of humor, I thought. Of course he didn't live on top of a wall by the sea. I knew that a battle of wits had just begun between us. I wasn't from the city of St. Malo. I'd only just arrived after a long carriage ride from Paris. We were on vacation, and staying there had been my mother's idea. I was excited. Until then, I'd only seen the sea a few times when I'd gone with Papa to Calais, where he took the ship to England. I'd seen it once in San Remo in Italy, too, but my parents said I was too young to remember that. But I did remember it. I really did. So the idea of spending all of the summer of 1870 at a seaside resort was wonderful. And my father had even said that we could stay longer if we wanted to. So, even though I eventually had to go back to school, this was going to be a nice and long summer. And it turned out to be the summer that changed my whole life. The trip to St. Malo had been terrible. The problem wasn't the carriage, which my father had spent a lot of money to hire, as he always did when he was looking after my mother and me. It was a carriage fit for a king, with 4 black horses, a coachman with a top hat, and seats covered with silk cushions. Even still, the 6-hour trip under the watchful gaze of Mama and Mr. Nelson made it seem like an eternity. Mr. Horatio Nelson was our butler. He was very tall, very quiet, and seemed very concerned about every little thing I did. The rest of the servants had left the week before to prepare our summer house for us. Mr. Nelson was the only one who'd stayed back. And he never took his eyes off me. He always seemed to be about to say to me, "Perhaps it is not appropriate for a lady to behave that way, Miss Irene." Perhaps it is not appropriate, Miss Irene, I thought. Mr. Nelson always said that whenever I was doing anything fun. And that was probably why, at the first chance I got, I escaped from our summer house and climbed up the winding path to the top of the city walls. Our vacation home had 2 floors. Although it was small, it was very pretty, with a big skylight in the roof and bigger bow windows, which I used to call boat windows when I was little. There was a trellis covered in ivy that crept all over the walls. When we first got there, my mother said, "Heavens! That ivy will be just full of animals." It took a few days before I realized what she'd meant. I'd left my bedroom window open one night, and the next morning Mr. Nelson found a snake slithering across the floor. "Perhaps it is not appropriate, Miss Irene, to leave the window open at night," Mr. Nelson had said sternly, entering my room. He'd then taken the poker from the fireplace and began to walk toward the snake. "Please don't kill it, Mr. Nelson," I'd cried. Mr. Nelson then sighed, put the poker down, and grabbed the snake in his hands. "Then I shall politely escort our little guest to the garden." Mr. Nelson was a grumpy man, but he always knew how to make me laugh. As soon as he'd left the room with my so-called guest, the wardrobe door popped open and a boy with a skinny face popped out. He was my other great friend during that long summer. His name was Arsène Lupin, the famous gentleman thief. But back then he hadn't yet begun his dazzling criminal career. And he was hardly a gentleman, considering he was only a couple of years older than I was, and even younger than Sherlock Holmes. Now you know the names of my friends. If you've guessed that a lot happened that summer, you'd be right. But it's best if I start at the beginning. What did you think of this Sherlock, Lupin, and Irene Adler audiobook? Did you like the ending? Who was your favorite character? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to our channel to not miss the next chapter. The mystery continues.